All right, hello everyone, and welcome to A Cup of Coffee, the show to go with your morning cup of coffee. I'm Umar, and this is my co-host Amaan.
Hey everyone. So Omer, what have you been thinking about this week?
Well, I've been on my phone a lot, as I think everyone has been, especially during quarantine. But I was just thinking about just sort of the role that news plays in our lives, especially in this modern age where everything's just become more connected and more accessible, and information can just with a couple button presses, information can flow. So I was just thinking about uh, the role of news specifically in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I think um, one thing that is really interesting to me is like the way that like the influence that it has nowadays that it didn't have before, because specifically because there's so much data going around that now, like even on your Twitter, there will be news catered specifically to what you're interested in, and
Right.
so it's going to be like essentially the media can now dictate exactly what you see even. So in that sense the news has changed quite a bit. At its core, it's always really been the tool used to give us the information that we need, which is really important. Um, and even though nowadays it's very different than what it used to be, I still think it's important, and what we get from it, just those moments when like something big is happening in the world and you're just sitting down looking at the news, and uh, like Donald Trump got elected, or something crazy is happening with the weather, there's some sort of natural disaster, you're sitting there watching it with family. The news always holds some special value to us.
Right, because now we know what's going on the other side of the world. Like even if you don't have family there, or but you know what's going on, right? Before months would go by before you figured out what was happening in the other part of the world, and by the time it
Exactly.
reached you, it was probably already over.
Yeah, and so there's nothing you can really do about it. But now we even have the power to change the things that are going on because of the news. So it's quite incredible.
Right, because even if something is not really being reported by outlets, someone could just pick up their phone, tweet it, and then that thing gets retweets, and now everyone's hearing about it.
Exactly. Yeah. So the power of just um, a single news source, a single journalist, is so great nowadays, because now you or I could even like just post something on Twitter or Instagram and it could blow up. There's different ways for you to make it blow up, but yeah, it's really cool that pretty much anyone has the power to be the media nowadays. David Perel is someone that I look up to on Twitter. He's really cool, and so he was able to just start tweeting, and because he has so much experience in other areas, when he got on Twitter and started writing, like he would post his website and his writings on Twitter, and people would look up to that, and so he was able to get a lot of uh, I don't know if there's a better word for this, but a lot of clout because of Twitter. Um,
Right.
and he would essentially use that as his platform, and he was able to just grow because of social media. When normally it's just before Twitter existed, it was just the normal media sources. So it's very interesting that we can do that
Yeah,
nowadays.
yeah, and you heard about that whole SARS thing going on in Nigeria, right? This is basically this whole thing about police brutality, right? And for like a while, like no real media outlet was covering it. Um, just because I think a lot of international news media doesn't really pay attention to things
Yeah.
going on in that region, unfortunately. But like that whole thing spread through Twitter. I found about it through Twitter because I'm on soccer Twitter a lot, and
Mm.
there's like a whole bunch of Nigerian fans uh, in the world, right? And they were all tweeting about it, and I was like, "Oh, but it's this," and just because of them, uh, a lot of awareness was raised, and eventually, bigger media outlets started picking it up.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, even in America now, you have NBA players and NFL players talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, and so there's a lot of important things that any figure has the power to report, and or just like they even stop playing a game because of it. So really, anyone with some sort of influence has the power to just spread the word about something and actually start to create change, which I think is incredible to do with journaling and with the news. But one thing about more so about, I guess this relates to journaling and writing more specifically, but I think it's very important to be able to write and let out the way that you feel, because so this is more so just journaling for the sake of like a personal journal, keeping it,
Right.
um, which you could do if you were, like journaling for the world and making sure that other people knew that they weren't alone. But I also try to keep a personal journal because I think it's important to either write things down or say things in a video journal, um, because it's somewhat therapeutic to just be able to let it out and um, just put it on a paper, and sometimes you figure out what's going wrong, and if you do it consistently you can catch yourself before you fall into uh, some like sadness or anxiety or lack of productivity. You
Right.
can figure those things out if you're journaling consistently, and so I think that's also very important, and you can relate that to people that journal, because the news exists so that we can like we can predict what's going to happen with the weather, what's going to happen with the economy politically,
Right.
and also exists so that we can understand that we're not alone, because there's a lot of people dealing with a lot of different things in the world. And if you see someone, you can find someone now because of the news, because of social media, that is going through something similar to what you're going through, so it has this power to connect us as well. So I think it's interesting that personal journaling versus and the news have such a have a similar impact, despite one being personal and one being global.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. And uh, I guess, journaling and journalism are sort of related in that
Yeah,
regard. It's probably why they have a similar root word.
maybe.
Uh, yeah, but yeah, I think that's really interesting how that personal connection or that personal sort of dictation or recording of what happened in your life uh, is fundamentally very similar to the recording of different events, which is basically what the news is.
Hmm.
Um, just well, and the other thing I've been thinking about the news is just how it can provide that comfort knowing someone out there is going through something similar to you are, or you find a heartwarming news story about someone who did a lot to help others. But um, the news is kind of a double-edged sword, especially these days, because, well, along with like a whole bunch of news being, not really pleasant to hear, especially, the daily news we hear about the coronavirus and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But like on top of that, like this, because of how easy it is to spread information, the flip side of that is that a lot of, misinformation and stuff like that can spread quite easily right now. Even
Yeah.
like not sometimes not even like a lot of the times it is malicious, but like sometimes someone makes a mistake and then everyone retweets it, and now a whole bunch of people think brown cows make chocolate milk or something.
Yeah. Exactly. That it's very easy for that to happen, and I think it has in many situations. Just like gone out, and then there was a correction of it. Like you've seen it where people found out about it, and there was a correction of it, like on Twitter or Instagram. But it could happen, and we just wouldn't know. Um, I think the media's yeah, that's what I mean when the media has like a lot of control over what we believe and what we know. like even what we hear. But at the same time, there's so many different sources. Like I personally feel like it's our responsibility to go out there and find all of the different sources because you
Right,
know.
because
Hmm.
and like on top of that, like you have to read more than the headline. You can't just
Hmm.
look at the headline because the way headlines are made, they're made for you to click on them,
Hmm.
not just look at them. Right? They're trying to catch your attention because with every click you make, these guys get more money. It's,
Yeah.
it's how advertisements work, right?
Yeah.
Um, but like sometimes when people just look at a headline, make their own conclusion. Oh, a lot of the time, and to just go away and retweet and be like, CNN said this, blah 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 blah, and
Yeah.
then it's like
Exactly.
that's not what it said in the article.
Yeah, you have to actually read it. And the thing is, yeah, like it's our responsibility to go and read those articles and to also look at the other side of the story. If you're just going to jump to a conclusion and not try to understand, like what what might have actually happened, like because there's a whole nother, like, and especially in America, we have two sides politically, right? If you're not going to look at both sides, both articles, right, you're just going to look at the ones that showed up on your Twitter feed, then of course you're going to have one opinion. If you don't want, if you don't want Twitter or whatever algorithm that you're using, like whatever app you're using to control the way that you think, then you would have to actually, it's your responsibility to go out there and look at multiple different opinions, right? And I think, yeah, like it's your responsibility to go and read the full article. So the problem is most people don't go through that effort. Most people don't, watch the presidential debates. Most people, and when you do, it's not like it's more so, it's important to watch like the senator debates, like between Beto and Ted Cruz and things like that, and then also do research on their policies because in the debates they're not necessarily going to be talking about all of their policies. You also have to find out what their beliefs are and what they want for, like if they were to be in office, what changes they would make, because then you can decide what you want to vote on. Otherwise, you don't really have as much of a you don't have an understanding of what's going on. And I just feel like it's our responsibility, not just as voters, but if you're going to have an opinion and if you're going to talk to people about it, and if you're going to tell the other side that they are wrong, then you should know your stuff first. And we learned that firsthand in a debate, but
Right.
it's more
Uh,
important now that the election's coming up more than ever.
well, yeah. Um, right, because in this day and age, like and like it's not like uh, we suddenly know about this happening because people have predicted that because like there's a whole bunch of good stuff that came from the internet, right?
Yeah.
You can talk to people on the other side of the world at the exact same times that happening to wait weeks for a letter. Online shopping, all that is great, but like as far as far back as the early 2000s with the game Metal Gear Solid 2, people were predicting that they'd use the internet for misinformation. Like I think at one point in the game, one of the characters asked the villain if they're trying to withhold information. They're like, no, we're trying to do the opposite. We're
Hmm.
trying to leak more and more information, just saturate how much information there is, because there's so much information out there, right?
Yeah.
And because the internet can spread so quickly and easily, right? So you
Hmm.
know, a poorly written article or a malicious, or maybe something maliciously written, like from Breitbart or something like that.
Yeah.
It just takes one person to share it, and then someone not paying too close attention shares that, and then it's just like it's this domino effect, and now 100,000 people have looked at this badly. I've looked at this bad news article, which isn't true.
Yeah, and there's also the Orwellian ideology. I think it's Orwellian, but like George Orwell's ideology in 1984 in Animal Farm, where like the Big Brother mentality, where like if there's more control, if there's more technology. Really, he was like, what would life be like in 1984? And so there would be more technology, and therefore the government would have more control. And so we see bits and pieces of that, with the media. Obviously, it's not nearly as close as to what George Orwell predicted. Just Big Brother having control over everything and us not being able to make any of our own decisions. But
Right.
there is a little bit of that, just because the media is so controlled. And I don't know if I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I've mentioned it like probably to you and our friends a million times. But the reason Trump won the election last time was because he got uh, Cambridge Analytica and Facebook to run ads and find out, because Cambridge Analytica had thousands of points of data on every single person in the United States that had a Facebook account, and they were able to find out who was not leaning left or right and just stuck in the middle, and would bombard them with ads for Trump, and eventually got them to vote for Trump in all of the right places, so that even though he didn't get the popular vote, he was able to get the electoral college and win the election. So
Right.
that he was able to use data to sway an entire election. He was able to do so simply because that's the power of the internet, it's the power of the media. And I think that's something we should consider. And that's something that we should really think about when we're only looking at one side of the story, or when just looking at a headline and not going through an article. When we really want to understand more about a subject, then you have to understand that it's your responsibility to go out there and look for these things.
Right.
But before we get into the guest segment, where we actually have a journalist coming in, this is why we're talking about the news.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little
Okay.
bit more about the lighter side of the news and the benefits that we get from it personally and globally.
Right. So, I mean, personally, I guess looking at local newspapers and stuff like that, a big uh, part for me is I should look at the local magazines a lot for food spots. And so actually, I've actually found a bunch of food spots. I think including Press Waffle Co. Uh,
Great place.
so yeah, so always look at your local newspapers for stuff like that, and also it's good for keeping up with stuff like your local elections. And those are really important, right? If we had, because if we had all the city council members that I wanted voted in, we wouldn't have had the situation where like the city council voted down the mask mandate earlier this year, right before Governor Abbott forced one.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, and just for internationally, it just helps me be really aware of the world. Like because of debate, I have like 6 different news apps on my phone. I've got BBC, The Guardian, a few others, right? And just it helps me keep track of what exactly is going on in the world, and not just not just in the U.S. because like there's a whole world out there. There's a whole big world out there, and I think you owe it to yourself to pay attention to what's going on around the world,
Yeah.
because the U.S. is the only place in the world, and it's good to pay attention to what goes on in other places, whether you think they affect you or not, because in some way they will. In some way they will, and even if they don't, it's still important to know what's going on in places like Europe, Africa, Asia,
Yeah.
lots of different countries within them. It's important to know what the big events are
Yeah.
in those areas,
Yeah.
because they pay attention to what's going on here. I feel like you owe it to them as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's our responsibility to try and help anyone that's less fortunate, and to be able to do that to someone, like to be able to help someone that's less fortunate in another country. We would have to first understand what's happening in other countries. We'd have to know that there's slavery going on in countries outside of the U.S. Still, you would have to know that workers aren't being treated the way that they should be in a lot of countries. You have to know that there's internment camps in China right now, things like this. I mean, if you want to create change for someone that's going through something right now, you have to pay attention to the news and actually know what's going on in the world. And that's what the news provides to us, right? That's what it gives us. And on a personal level, seeing news sometimes and being able to understand that, like seeing on Good Morning America, just like all of this stuff to help people lose weight. It's like, oh, I'm not the only one that's dealing with that problem. Seeing our upcoming guests' articles, who is he's my cousin as well, and so just seeing his articles about certain things and seeing what he's talked about, which we will get into more later, but it has also helped me in a lot of ways, and so that's why I think journaling is important. The news is a very important resource, as you said, for us locally and globally to pay attention to what's going on in the world, but also to understand that we're not alone in the world. And I think that's all the time that we have for this segment. I'm very excited for the upcoming segment. So,
All right.
cue the transition, and we'll see you in a bit. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We are here with our guest, Bilal Lakhani. So, Bilal, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I am Aman's cousin, first of all. That's my first claim to fame. But then beyond that, I am a journalist and a columnist for Express Tribune. I've also got sort of a corporate career in communications. And then the other, I think, interesting thing that I want to talk a little bit about today is I'm a very passionate advocate for mental health. So I've sort of had interesting experiences with anxiety, with clinical depression, and that sort of led to a lot of self-exploring on success, happiness, a lot of themes like these. So I think we'll have an interesting conversation today.
Yeah, I think so as well. And I'm really excited to get into the main conversation about mental health because we've had some very interesting conversations about that on our podcast. And I've had some very interesting conversations about that with you. But the first question that I really want to ask, just to get to know a little bit more about you and so that the viewers can understand more about you as well, is what got you into your career and why do you enjoy doing that?
I think the biggest thing is that I love talking and I love writing, and I think that had a lot to do with me sort of choosing communications and journalism as a field that I wanted to pursue a career in. It was also a series of happy accidents, and it was also sort of a drive to be able to make an impact beyond oneself. So sort of to do something more than just a traditional 9 to 5 job and sort of live life the way that it's typically expected of us. So I think it was sort of multiple factors, but the actual journey was a series of happy accidents. So I went to LUMS, which is a university in Pakistan in Lahore.
Mm-hmm.
I studied economics there, and then I got an internship in HR at Procter and Gamble. Did that, and then when it was time to offer me a job, they're like, okay, we don't have a job in HR. We've got a job in external relations. So I'm like, okay, thought about that for a couple of months, decided to sort of venture into external relations, which is now communications. But then when it was time for me to go in and sort of sign on the dotted line, they're like, oh, now we've got an opening in HR and we've got an opening in external relations. You've got to make a choice now. And I was literally there in that room. And at that point in time, literally, like that was like a random decision that changed the trajectory of my life. And I was like, no, now I'm set on doing external relations. That's the way that I want to go. And then it just started from there. I worked there for 2 years. And then I resigned from there to do a year of grad school in journalism at Columbia University in New York. Did that for a year. Went back to Pakistan, said I want to pursue my journalism, but I don't want it to be my source of income. I want my source of income to be independent. So then I decided to do both. I was still having my corporate career and still sort of doing my journalism on the side. And that led to sort of an interesting vantage point. So in my corporate career, I kept moving. They moved me out of Pakistan to Geneva for a couple of years. So I was based in Switzerland. Then they moved me to the US, where I've been for the last 4 years. In parallel, my sort of journalism career was continuing. I did a lot of documentaries and a lot of work on extraordinary Pakistanis, basically profiling ordinary people who were doing extraordinary things. And then first I thought like only my mom was reading my work, but then eventually it sort of took off. I got to interview the president of Pakistan multiple times. So it's sort of it's been an interesting journey, but I'd say it's more been a series of happy accidents and some unhappy accidents as well. and sort of that's the flow of my life and my career.
It's really interesting. I think it's really cool that you just made that decision like in that moment to take your life in a certain direction and just let that guide you. Just were guided by your passion for a while. That's something that I think is really interesting. And now, for the question that we've all been waiting for, or the subject that we've all been waiting for, about anxiety. So first, if you could give like a quick, brief description of your article, first on anxiety, and then maybe we could talk a little bit more about how you've dealt with it, and maybe how Umar and I and other people may have had to deal with it as well.
Yep. So I think anxiety is something that I've experienced almost since I remember gaining human consciousness. And this is not something that I realized then because I didn't know what anxiety was. This is something that I realize now. And I still remember the first moment. I was 8 years old. My dad was sort of moving to Saudi Arabia, so he went a little bit before the family. And I was just crying and crying and crying. And I remember your dad was also actually with us from the way back to the car. And everybody's like, why is Bilal crying? And basically, I was having an anxiety attack when I was like 8 years old. And I was afraid that if something happens to my dad, he's sort of the breadwinner of our family. What's going to happen? We're going to become homeless. And it was sort of this catastrophic thinking at the age of 8, which was completely irrational, that sort of overtook me. And I built my first anxiety coping habits there as well. So I started praying. I started reading the Quran. I started, spending all night up in sort of meditative prayer. And I was 8 years old, and it was fascinating. But that's how much it sort of weighed on me. And so then in the article, I sort of explain, now I can post rationalize it. My father's father, my dada, passed away when my dad was young. So we had grown up with stories of how the family had to deal with that when my dada passed away. And so that was bearing heavily on me. And then sort of my entire joy was also sort of coming from there. So I still remember when my dad did decide to move to Saudi, we were under debt. So we could now finally see a pathway to sort of pay off our debts. And so as a treat, my dad decided to order a plate of French fries and ketchup. And I still can sense the taste of those French fries and ketchup to this day. And every time, and the breeze on my face as well. And so every time I feel a good breeze or I'm in a good mood, I can still feel like that's how visceral those memories are. And then I talked about sort of the converse of it. So what happened as a result of that is that I became sort of an insecure overachiever. So sort of, I gave my best to sort of my corporate work. I gave my best to my journalism. And a lot of that was fueled by my anxiety. A lot of that was fueled by the fact that, if I don't do it, then, I'm going to be in a bad place and I'm not going to be able to survive. I'm not going to be able to do the things that I want to do. And so that anxiety became inbred. So part of my DNA. And now, I just thought it was normal. I just thought everybody wakes up anxious. I just thought everybody sleeps, with anxiety, and that it's a regular thing. And it was not until much later and with, hundreds of therapy sessions later that I realized that, anxiety is not a normal thing. And it's something that you've got to take head on. So that was basically the crux of the article.
Okay. By the way, we'll link that article in the description below.
Yeah.
So just it's more on anxiety and working as a journalist. I'm sure that's added to the anxiety. So I'm just wondering, how do you deal with the anxiety coming from being a journalist? Because I'm sure it's a different kind of anxiety that you get from your day-to-day activities and from your corporate job.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting. Given my passion for journalism, the act of journalism itself does not give me anxiety. The act of succeeding in journalism gives me anxiety. And the act of wanting to do and be so many things to so many people, including myself, and the expectations that I post on myself of being a journalist, that's what really gives me anxiety. The work itself, the only piece of anxiety is like trolling. And people calling you names and people calling you fake news or saying that you're sold out or cursing at you. And that's something that, you develop a thick skin on, and that doesn't affect me at all. But what does affect me is the idea that I'm not good enough, that I want to be better, that I want to be doing more. Why am I not producing more videos? Why am I not producing more content? Why am I not writing better? I think that's the part of the anxiety that gets to me. And the reason why that's so frustrating is because the reason why you get into journalism, basically journalists are like kindergartners. You know how when a kid goes to school and the teachers, he or she draws something, and then the teacher's like, oh, you get a 10 out of 10, and then he comes home and then he shows it to everybody, in the house and says, look what I did. That's basically what journalists like to do. They like to write something, or they like to say something, and then they want to, like, show it off to everybody that they know and be like, oh, look. And there's sort of wonder, there's joy, there's like childish innocence with that. But instead of being able to nurture that, and instead of being able to celebrate that, I'm sort of crushed by the anxiety of my own expectations and how I should be doing more. And I think that's where the anxiety for journalism sort of comes in from.
Yeah, I definitely think that's really what it is with anxiety, is that when you're actually being productive and doing the things that you need to be doing, and it seems like everything's on track, then you're not anxious. Like if I'm in class at the moment and it seems like, okay, like I've gotten all my homework done and everything else is going fine, then I'm not going to be anxious. But the moment I leave class and I think that, like, oh, I forgot this one assignment, that's when it starts, right? And all of that leading up, like it has a snowball effect in my head, right? Is like, okay, I haven't done this. And then it's like, okay, I didn't do this homework. That might make my grade a B, which actually could turn really bad if I don't do good on the test. And then all of a sudden in my head, I'm flunking out of school and everyone I know is disappointed in me. And so it's just this snowball effect. And another thing that I personally struggle with, and it sounded like with journaling, you've had to deal with this as well, is the feeling that you're not doing enough. And for me personally, a lot of the feeling of being overwhelmed by how much I have to do when that combines, it's very, um, it sucks because you feel overwhelmed with the amount that you have to do, and then you also feel like you're not doing enough at the same time, right? Because if I'm thinking, okay, I'm not doing enough right now, and then I look at how much I have to do and I'm overwhelmed by the amount that I have, then I start getting incredibly anxious because there's way too much going on right now. And I think that's a feeling that a lot of people deal with quite a bit. And that's why I really enjoyed your article about happiness and success. Should you be happy or should you be successful? Because, okay, if I'm anxious about how much I have to do, then I should just lower the amount I have to do, right? It should be that simple in your head, but it doesn't always end up being that way. And then you wouldn't feel as successful. But what really defines success, and why can't happiness just be that success for many of us? And why can't they come together? I think it gave me a lot of closure reading, or like satisfaction reading that article, knowing that I'm not the only one that deals with this. I have other friends that have dealt with feeling overwhelmed and at the same time feeling like you're not doing enough. Um, so, sort of getting into that article about happiness and success, how do you value your happiness, and what do you consider to be success in your life right now?
Yep. So before I come to that, I want to tackle the anxiety piece specifically. So after I wrote that article and I was sort of, going through the motions of anxiety, one of the interesting things that I did to sort of lift this burden of expectations is I said, okay, for the next 3 months, like till the end of the year, I only have one goal, which is how to overcome my anxiety and improve my mental health. I was like, put all the clutter in your day-to-day life, like all the things that you're achieving, like in your career, outside of your career, in your relationships. I was like, put all that on the side. I have one singular objective, which is how do I take less anxiety and how do I overcome my anxiety? And that lifted a lot of my burden, because at the end of the day, I was only asking myself, did I manage my anxiety better? And then there were obviously tools that were helping me: pray, having a morning routine, other sort of things that were helping me get there. So I was keeping a track of them, but that was the only thing that I was worrying about. I was only worrying about anxiety. It's kind of ironic, but that's the only thing that I was taking anxiety about. And that was very powerful. And that sort of then led to questions of, why am I so anxious? And that then led to how do I define happiness and how do I define success. So a lot of anxiety was coming from the fact that am I happy and am I successful? When I would ask those questions, that's what would start the anxiety trail. Or they would be at the end of my anxiety trail. So suppose I'm feeling anxious about not being on top of my work. And then if I unpack that, like, why does it matter that I need to be on top of my work? It's because I want to be happy or successful. So if you boil down all the questions, they came to the same two questions. Am I happy? Am I successful? So the first thing that I taught myself is I need to ask that question to myself less. I asked myself that question too many times, like several times. Even within the day, I would ask myself that question multiple times. Am I happy? Am I happy? Am I successful? And that is actually part of the problem, not part of the solution. So one of the things that I'm trying to do also is to, and this is something my therapist taught me, which is to create a box in my head. And every time I get asked questions like that, or every time I get anxiety, I basically put those questions in a box and say, okay, I'm only going to open it at a certain time of the day. So every time I feel that thought, I dump that thought into that box and shut the door and be like, okay, got it, received it, but I'm not going to think about it. I'm going to think about it at this time. So that sort of helped me. Now, what is success and what is happiness? These are the most fundamental underlying questions of our lives. And I don't have an answer for what does success mean to me today. I'm confused. And the most profound thing about this is that I have never been confused about this question in my life. And when I was not confused about this question, I was anxious. Now that I am confused about this question, I am less anxious. Because when I had clearly defined that success means this, and for me, originally success was that I had a purpose, that I want to make a positive difference in the lives of people. I want to make Pakistan a better place. I wanted to do that through my journalism. I wanted to do that through my advocacy. And that was sort of a pressure builder or a pressure cooker for me, because it's virtually limitless. Like you could do like as much as you want to do. And that pressure began to gnaw at me, and I couldn't deal with that pressure to sort of be more successful in that path. Then I was like, okay, how about I focus on my happiness? And the fascinating thing about my happiness is that first, I didn't know what makes me happy. I was like, okay, what makes me happy? I've been so focused on being successful that I was like, okay, what makes me happy? Yeah. Then I sort of defined that. I was like, okay, there are three things that disproportionately drive happiness in my life, or when I'm most content. One, when I have a strong relationship with God. Two, when I have a strong relationship with people around me. So my family and my friends who I really enjoy time with, they add a lot of happiness to my life. And the third was making a difference in the lives of other people. But it was sort of like Maslow's like theory of what is it? Is it happiness? No, it's not. It's self-fulfillment. I don't know exactly what the technical term of it is, but it basically says, you need food, shelter, water. Then you need, to be able to earn enough. And then ultimately you've got self-fulfillment or actualization. Right. But it's actually a pyramid. What I was doing is I was not worrying about the rest of the pyramid. I was just trying to reach for self-fulfillment directly. And that's why I kept tripping over that pyramid, because I tried to achieve that without building a foundation of happiness or a happy life. Now there's a joke that, underneath that hierarchy, the first thing is Wi-Fi, even before you sort of need all. So I think that's been an interesting journey. And that's where I am on my journey today, which is, I'm only going to focus on getting rid of anxiety for the next 3 months, which is, I'm first going to make myself happy. I'm first going to build happy routines. I'm first going to I'm going to be selfish, and I'm going to put myself and my own happiness and my own needs first. I'm going to build that at the bottom of the pyramid. And then I'm going to try to climb the ladder of self-fulfillment and say, okay, what do I need to do to help others? What do I need to do to be successful? So I'm sort of flipping the paradigm for the first time in my life. And now I don't know what success is. Is success building that routine, or is success still sort of climbing on top of it? And I'm letting myself stay confused, which is really interesting. It's hard, but that's what's allowing me to sort of climb out of anxiety slowly.
Okay, so there's comfort in the uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. I would say that there is, I mean, comfort is an interesting word. I would say that it is uncomfortable, the confusion, but there's comfort in not driving me to figure it all out today. Because the pressure was you must have it all figured out if you want to move further. And I'm no longer putting pressure on myself for that, because that causes me anxiety, and my number one goal is to not have anxiety. So yeah, that's overriding all my systems.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier about stuff like building like happy routines and stuff to deal with anxiety. Just out of curiosity, I'm sure one of those routines must be like what you do in journalism and stuff like that. So I was just wondering what exactly, well, maybe not exactly, but like what your routine is when working as a journalist.
So it's actually broken right now, and it's one of the things that does cause me anxiety. But I think the job of a good journalist is to hunt a good story, is to figure out, what everybody can see, but nobody is talking about. So what is it that is apparent, that is public, but people have not connected dots in a certain way? And that takes a lot of reading and a lot of understanding and a lot of talking to different people. And one of the things that I realized was happening because of my anxiety is my attention span was shrinking. So what happens when you're anxious is you can't focus on one thing and you can't go deeper into it. So sort of you read something, you're listening to something, and then you just pan out and you sort of daze into your thoughts of anxiety. And I think I want to get better at that. So one of the routines that I want to put in place, I don't have it at the moment, is to spend 1 hour in the morning reading about the things that I want to write about, and 1 hour in the day listening to stories that I aspire to tell. So yesterday I was watching this random documentary about this Bangladeshi rapper from Queens. And it was so fascinating because I used to live in Queens here in New York, and it was sort of being able to see my own city through the lens of that guy who I could relate to a little bit, because he's Bengali Pakistani, not because I'm a rapper. So that sort of was interesting to be able to understand, and that inspired me. And typically I would be like, oh, I'm wasting my time, I'm not being productive. And then yesterday I was like, because I'm in this new phase where I'm like, the only thing I need to do is not be anxious. And I got done with my work like early on Friday, and I had like all afternoon to myself. And I'm like, oh, what should I do? Should I just waste time scrolling aimlessly on my phone? Should I, watch some documentary? Should I write something? Should I be productive? And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna let me do whatever the hell I want to do. I'm not gonna make a decision. I'm just gonna go in, and I basically wasted the entire afternoon and the evening. And so clearly I need to be a little bit more smarter than that. But I'm giving myself the license to be aimless. And I think there's a lot of power in doing less to do more. And I think I want to sort of explore that. And the reason for that, it's also interesting. When you first go down that path, you feel like you're giving up or you're failing, and that you're not going to achieve the objectives that you've set for yourself. But then I tell myself, and I'm a lot older than you guys, so I'm 33 now, and I was like, okay, for 33 years I've been trying it. It's clearly not working. I'm like clearly more anxious. Yes, I've been successful, but the cost of that success has been my own mental health. So it's not working. So I'm going to give myself the liberty. So what if it takes 2 years to figure this out? Like, I've spent 33 years like this. It's not worth it. That's the other powerful sort of moment of clarity that I had. I was like, okay, what if I am successful? What if I achieve everything that I want to be? The truth is that I know now through my experience that my happiness is not in that achievement. My happiness is just not having anxiety. So what if I could take a shortcut to that happiness? What if I could teach myself how not to be anxious? And this is where that article about, success and happiness sort of came from, which is, we always think, success is the end goal, happiness is the end goal. And once we're successful, we can be happy. But what if it's the opposite? What if first, if you're happy, you can sort of give yourself the license to then, pursue your success? So those are some of the thoughts that I'm going through at the moment on that.
Okay.
Uh,
So going back to, there's a lot in there, a lot of valuable stuff for me, and I hope for those of you watching. But one thing that I thought was really interesting was that you talked about that afternoon where you gave yourself the liberty to be aimless and to just let your mind wander and yourself wander wherever, whatever you wanted to do in that
Mm-hmm.
moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's a lot of beauty in being able to do that for yourself. So there's, I guess there's two different ways that that could go, right? And all of us know this. You know, you could end up playing different video games and like watching different YouTube videos and looking into Bangladeshi rappers from Queens, right? You know, just all of this random stuff. But I think there's a line that we can define where it feels like you're wasting that time
Mm-hmm.
versus it feels like you're learning more about yourself and about the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so say Norma and I have done this actually, where we just went to the city and didn't know exactly what we were going to do. We had like a rough idea of what we wanted to do, and we just went to the city and then we just started aimlessly wandering in the arts district. We looked at some art and then we went and got some food, right? I've done this with my brother in Chicago. And so
Mm-hmm.
that kind of, and that's on the far end of the spectrum, but that feels adventurous, right? It
Mm-hmm.
feels like at that time in that day I'm going to learn something about myself and I'm going to find something, I'm going to see something beautiful that in that day, and I'm going to really enjoy it. And even though I might not be working on the things that I love doing, when I
Mm-hmm.
come back home, I'm going to have a fresh perspective about whatever I'm doing, and it's sort of going to make you feel recharged instead
Mm-hmm.
of making you feel unproductive. And
Mm-hmm.
I had this stretch of days one time where I just didn't want to do the work that I wanted to do. And
Mm-hmm.
I started reading The Theory of Everything by Stephen Hawking. I was in class one day and I was like,
Mm-hmm.
I just want to read this book. And then 3 days later, or like it was like the start, like I read it throughout that entire day and the second day, and then the next day I had it finished.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just like, whoa, that was, what a journey that was. And
Mm-hmm.
normally a lot of people would have felt like, okay, I'm not doing the work that I need to be doing, that's not productive. My work doesn't involve physics, so Stephen
Mm-hmm.
Hawking's book shouldn't be useful to me. But when I got back to everything that I was trying to work on, I had such a different perspective on everything because the world that I was living in those last 2 days was completely different from where my head was when I was anxious and when I felt like I needed to like all of that weight on my shoulders was there. You know, my perspective was renewed after that, and I felt refreshed and recharged, able to do the work that I needed to do. So I guess, you know, is there a way to make our everyday lives, our everyday enjoyments, is there a way to make them feel like they're recharging you? And if not, where you draw the line between something making you feel more productive versus making you feel like you're wasting your time?
So that is such a fascinating question. And I even had an experience with that same book, The Theory of Everything, around 2 weeks ago. So I was like, okay, I've now built like a new reading habit, like where 1 hour before I sleep, I sort of read something. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna pick this book. I already had it at my place. I was like, okay, I'm actually gonna read it. And then I read the first few pages and I'm like, I'm not enjoying this. And then I'm like, no, but I need to read it. I want to read it. And I'm like, do I really? And then I had like another book with me, which was more like something that I was interested in. It was like sort of the history of the Iraq War and sort of some key players there. And I'm sort of a political junkie. So like, I really want to read that, but I think I need to read this. You know what? I'm going to dump that book. And it's still by my bedside. So sort of it's still sort of in the graveyard of books next to my bedside. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to throw it right there. And I'm just going to read what I want to read. And the reason why that's interesting is because I think the answer to your question lies in the framing of your question. So essentially, what you're asking me is, can we make our unproductive time feel productive? And that is one of the dumbest things that we can do to ourselves. And the reason for that, and this is part of the productivity fetish that sort of exists in the society that we live in. So, particularly the United States, but sort of more broadly around the world as well, where we think that we are only good or only happy as long as we're productive. And this is one of the biggest lies of our lives. I don't know if you guys see, there's this really trashy show on Netflix called Emily in Paris. And it's this basically young American girl who's like a social media manager, and she lands up in Paris for a year to sort of work for a French company there. And she's like, oh, I really enjoy my work. I really love my work. And so, this and that. And then the French woman over there is like, you love work? Like, why do you love work? Why would anybody love work? Like, work is work. And this idea that being productive is being good is part of the problem, not part of the solution. So I think, even the burden of you saying that I want to reframe my unproductivity, or I want to think of my recharge time as a way to refresh myself to then when I go back to work, I come with different perspectives and new energy. That's part of the problem. That means that you are only allowing yourself the state of happiness and the state of success while you're at work and while you're being productive, when that is not the only part of your life, when that is not the only driver of your happiness and your success. But when you make it that singular driver, that becomes then the cause of everything else that's happening from an anxiety point of view. So I think the first thing is to give yourself the license to be unproductive, the license to say, I am going to take a couple of hours off and just enjoy myself. And it has nothing to do with what happens the next morning. So I think giving yourself that license is very important for your mental health. Now, yes, if you stay within the paradigm that you're in, and you say, you want to be productive, and yes, like sort of reading a book or doing something else can help me sort of become better. That's true. That's also true. But if you do that to yourself, you're doing a disservice. And let me go one final layer deeper, which is, why do you actually do this? You do this because there is a fetishization of the American dream that if you work hard, you'll actually make it and you'll be successful and you'll sort of be this and that. But if you actually look at the facts, most American wealth is inherited, not earned. It is, I was talking about this yesterday. I was like, one of the most fascinating things is the thing that's better about Pakistan than America is nobody actually believes in Pakistan that you can work hard to become rich. In this country, people are actually dumb enough, pardon my language, to think that if they work hard enough and if they work 2 jobs, they can become a part of the 1%, when that's actually the exception, not the rule. And so you're sort of in this rat race, but it's actually not taking you where you think it's going. And sort of the anxiety and the cost of that is something that you're bearing personally. So you've got to think about, and everybody needs to make their own personal choice in terms of how they want to answer that question. But that question is sort of at the root of you saying, how do I make my unproductive time productive? It's actually, that question is part of the problem.
I think, yeah, it's something that we've talked about before. It's like, you can't think of it as having to make you productive. Otherwise, you're just going to be stressed the entire time, right? It has to be completely like, if I'm playing a video game right now, it's not so that I can be recharged in the morning. It's just so that I can enjoy it right now. And I'm glad that you called me out on that, because I think about my my time to relax a lot of in that way. And I guess, because of this, I'll try to make it so that I'm not just constantly thinking of it as, okay, I'm doing this right now so that I can be productive later. I'm taking a break from my work. It shouldn't be a break from your work. It should be a part of your day. It should be so that you can help yourself be happier. I love that you mentioned that. And I think, yeah, like that dream that everyone has to be productive, once that becomes your life, once that becomes everything that you're doing, like you have like a bunch of productivity apps, and then that's constantly your day, that's everything that you're doing and you're thinking about. It's sort of, yeah, like it adds to your anxiety. And then when you're out with friends, you feel bad about it because you're like, I'm not doing what I need to be doing right now. And so everything comes back to that one thing. And so there's this very interesting ideology that I'm sure you've heard, and that has been mentioned time and time again, where you should be focused on what you should make these things, like journaling like you do, and podcasting like we do, is, we are not podcasters. You are not a journalist. You are a guy that does journaling. We are people that have a podcast, right? So this isn't who I am, right? This is what I
Mhm.
do. And
Mhm.
once you make it your entire identity, that's when the problem starts, in my opinion, is like, okay, once this is all I am, once my dream is everything that I am, then I'm
Mhm.
not going to be able to separate myself from that. So even when I'm playing games or watching a show or just, doing whatever I want to be doing, that is a podcaster not being focused on his craft, a student not being focused on his studies. That's what that becomes. Rather, it should be, just me, Aman, doing what I want to be doing in that moment, right? And that would create the least anxiety and, provide for happiness. And a side benefit, and I am still thinking of it in this way because I can't separate my mind from it. A side benefit would just be that you feel recharged afterwards, right? But that can be, that doesn't have to be to make you more productive. It could just make you feel better about whatever, about yourself and about everything that you're doing.
One more way to frame this is to say that hanging out with my friends is my happiness and work is not. So, sort of to flip the paradigm. And there's also another saying that says, do you live to work or work to live?
Hmm.
Right? And the whole point of you going to work or doing whatever you're doing to be able to earn a living is so that then you can spend that time that you have and that money that you have on things that you enjoy doing.
Yeah.
And it's ironic that we look at that joy as the problem and the work is the solution when it's actually the opposite. Like work is in service of your life. Your life is not in service of work.
Hmm.
And so you should actually, again, I'm going to challenge you on that paradigm and be like, when you're spending time with friends, you should be like, this is what my whole life is about, which is to spend time having fun with the people that matter most to me because they bring happiness.
Hmm.
And I think that part becomes really important. Now, there's an argument about balance, so I can also become lazy at times. So you gotta think about, if all you're doing 24 hours is playing video games, and that's a
Yeah.
challenge of a different kind. But to the extent that you're doing it, in your leisure time, there should be no stress about it.
Yeah. I also think that it's possible to have fun working, though. I like not, I wouldn't call it work at that point, really, because I mean, like, okay, this podcast doesn't work to me, right? I've never felt like it's a burden
Mhm.
at any point. I enjoy the conversations that we have, and I enjoy the editing afterwards, even because I get to learn from that. And I've had fun doing programming projects. I guess the main things that I haven't had fun in was when it was strictly considered work, and I was at like a retail store doing my job, or if I was
Mhm.
at school in class. I would never really enjoy those things just because they're labeled as school and work, and that's just their existence is just not happiness to me. Whereas editing and making other videos or working on a personal project can sometimes be thrilling and put me into a mode where I feel like I'm enjoying this and learning from it at the same time. I feel like that's something that I want to get into more. And I but my question to you is, if I'm considering that as work and not something that's fun, then would I still be able to have those moments? Because I assume you do with journaling have those moments a lot where you really enjoy what you're doing, right? Because it doesn't make you feel anxious in the act of journaling. So do you consider that work? Do you consider that fun for you? Where's the line, really?
Yeah, and I think this is where the happiness and success conversation becomes really easy, becomes really profound, is that whether I feel it's work or joy depends not on the actual work, but my state of mind. It depends on my state of mind at that moment. So, the simple answer to your question is, when I was making YouTube videos just for the fun of it, I was really enjoying it. When I became monetized, I was like, oh, now if I do more, I'll earn more. And then I suddenly stopped doing it because the joy went away. Because now there was pressure involved. Or similarly, when I was writing and I was just writing for the fun of it, it was a lot of fun. And it was like, to surprise people, to delight people, like that was a lot of fun. But then when I started writing with a particular objective in mind that, I need to write this many articles or I need to, write this many pieces on this many topics, then it suddenly became a burden. So that's one part of it, which is, like I'm really enjoying this podcast because I don't need to do anything except talk. And that's what I should be doing on my podcast too. But for me, it becomes a burden. The same thing when I do it with you is fun, but when I do it for my work, like it becomes work, right? Like when I do it with an expectation. So I think that part is interesting. But then even in my sort of ordinary life, like if I am happy that day, like if I'm satisfied, like if I had a good routine, if I'm feeling good about myself, I will enjoy that doing that piece of work, even if it's hard. But if I'm not having a good day that day, then that will feel like an additional burden on top of everything else that I already have. And this is why I think happiness becomes more important than success, because happiness then allows you to fuel your passions and fuel, your energy to what you want to do to become successful. But if you try to become successful without happiness, it does feel like work.
Yeah.
It does feel like, okay, I'm going to do more and more and more. So I think that part, that's at least where I'm like a snapshot of my journey at this point in time, where I'm like, okay, first, if I can become happy, then I can become happy about my work.
Yeah, but you can't become happy with the intention of it making you successful. Otherwise, it won't actually make you happy.
Yeah.
Right.
And the other thing is like all of this sounds really complicated. So there are two important nuances, which is it's different for everybody. And the only way to figure it out is to try it. And this is one of the things that I felt really dumb about when my therapist said it. So my therapist is like, oh, I want you to give up these things and I want you to start these things. And I'm like, okay, what if I'm not able to do it? Or what if I do it for 2 days and then I'm not able to do it the third day? And he's like, you'll wake up the next morning and you'll start again. And I was like, oh, okay. So the point is, like, you try different things, you see what works for you, and doesn't work for you, you try again another day, and then you see, what's working, what's not working, and then you sort of build your life around what's working. But it's interesting, we don't make the effort to be able to do that. We're not sort of, we give up too easily when it comes to finding what really makes us happy.
Right. I feel like oftentimes, like even when we do find that happiness and we're doing it well, like me with writing or other people with art, and we find it makes us happy, but then like you said that, but like when you find out that you can do something with it, like people like talk about like making money out of doing things that you enjoy. It feels like when you add that money part, when you add that checklist, it just sort of, that checklist is sort of what takes away the joy of it. Like I enjoy writing, different pieces. Sometimes I write poetry, sometimes they're short snippets just to make people laugh, right? But then when I have to, hit a word count or, write a specific way because I'm sending it to a magazine or something or like that, then it's just not enjoyable. And I've heard friends like talk about commissions that they're just not that much fun.
Mm-hmm.
Like when it feels like you're obligated to do something that you're matching a checklist, then even like creative stuff can feel like any other work, like just putting together cabinets or stocking shelves. It becomes like almost like that.
Yep, and I think that's very true. So I write a column weekly that's around 700 words, and I can tell when I'm writing to complete 700 words, and I can tell when I'm writing to tell a story, and it's a very different experience, even though it's the same 700 words. But sort of the lens through which you do it really impacts what you enjoy and what you don't enjoy. And it's very true, but that's your body trying to signal something to you in terms of, just like pain. So I gave this example in my article, which is like, if you put your finger through a candle and it pricks, that's because it's giving you a burning sensation. The issue is not the burning sensation. The burning sensation is actually helping you identify the issue. So imagine if God had not let your finger feel burning or feel that pain. Essentially, you would keep your finger there and the finger would burn away. That's the real problem. So similarly, when you're feeling anxiety and when you're feeling that prick or when you're not enjoying something, that's your body's way of telling you, hey, something's not right about the way in which you're doing this. And then the question, so we then, become more obsessed with the anxiety, but what we need to be obsessed with is what is the anxiety trying to tell us? And then trying to explore and unpack and confront that challenge head on. So I think that part is also interesting, which is maybe the answer to that for you is, you're going to write for yourself and what makes you happy most of the time. And then when you need to do an assignment for somebody or for something, you're going to be in a different zone when you do that. So I've seen a lot of creative people do that. Like they create two zones, one where they be creative for creative sake, and they do the projects for themselves, and then others when they're doing it for some other material benefit. So being able to put yourself in those two different spaces allows you to not feel like you're cheating on yourself.
Yeah, I think that doing it for yourself is something that like I've felt a lot because so I think I mentioned it to you before, but I started a YouTube channel called the 20-Hour Project where I would learn something over the course of 20 hours. So when no one knew about that and I was just doing it for myself, it seemed a lot easier to, do the actual work and then editing the video, and I was having so much fun doing that. But this last one that I'm trying to do, it just feels so tedious because now it's out there in the world, and maybe I'm not just doing it for myself. But and I had a friend who made a video that was just for himself, and he seemed to have a lot of fun doing it just because he didn't care about what anyone else might have thought when he released it. He was just doing it for himself so that he could look back on it and enjoy it. And like I feel like Omer and I have talked about this with the podcast, is that we considered it a success and we were happy about it at the same time, simply because we had hit that goal of, people had listened to some of our podcasts and said that they really enjoyed it, and it may have helped someone out there. And at its core, I have learned a lot from this experience. I've learned a lot just in the last 40 minutes, right? And that could constitute it as a success for me. But that's because when I do this, when we do what we're doing, I'm doing this for me, and that comes back to everything that we've talked about, spending time alone. You're doing it for yourself, right? When you are working on something creative, and I even hesitate to call it work, when you're doing something creative, when you're enjoying it, and when you're doing that for yourself, there's a different kind of feeling and a different kind of passion that comes with that. There was this sort of freedom that I felt the other day because, I've learned how to draw recently, but I could only copy photos. And so one thing that I did recently was I just drew on a paper. I just said, you know what, I'm just going to draw whatever I feel like drawing and see what comes out on the paper. And so whatever was in my head in that moment would just come out onto the paper. And I took a picture of it, but I threw away the paper afterwards. So it was just gone. So that was simply just for me, right? And that was when I felt the most free. And I think that whether you're talking about work, whether you're talking about your goal of happiness, no matter what you're talking about, doing it for yourself creates this very different kind of freedom and aimlessness. Just doing it for yourself and letting your mind wander. That's why therapy is so helpful, and that's what I think I need to do more, is do things for myself and see where it takes me, actually enjoy these things, and then think about success afterwards once I've figured things out.
Yeah. And the irony is that you actually do your best work when you do it for yourself. So I actually remember I wrote my first book when I was 17, and it was on religion, and it was on sort of my religious experiences in my life till then. And obviously now I think it's a really amateur book, but a lot of people benefited from it because I wrote it for myself. I was like, okay, this is what I don't want to forget, because I lived a very sheltered sort of upbringing in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And so sort of I was like, before the world opens up to me and before I open up to the world, I want to sort of it was almost like a time capsule of what I was thinking. And, that book did like much better than I thought it would ever do. Like I was a 17-year-old kid writing on religion. And I think that part, like whenever, so even the anxiety article that you guys are referring to, I actually wrote it for myself. It was sort of journaling my own therapy. It was actually like a therapy session where I was like, okay, this is what I'm feeling right now. I want to put it down. And I had stopped writing about mental health in sort of the recent past. So when I wrote it, and it had like such a massive impact, like the amount of people who reached out and said, oh, I'm going through the same thing. I was like, oh God, I didn't mean it for other people. I actually meant it for myself. And that was, and now if I try to do it and I write it like for an audience and I like it for like clicks, it's not going to have the same impact because it's not coming like I'm not the audience. So that's like, it's really strange and ironic that when we do it for ourselves, it's actually better.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have much time remaining, and we're already over time. But just have one more thing because we always like to ask our guests for advice, and we've already gotten some really great stuff from you. But just as a parting note, what advice do you have to someone that's trying to figure out whether they should focus on their happiness or their success, and they feel anxious about it, and and they're just confused, like you've mentioned before. They don't really know what direction to go in. What advice do you have to those people out there?
I think the first piece of advice, and this is something I'm following myself, is to stop putting pressure on yourself to answer that question. So ask that question less often. And that sounds very counterintuitive because how do you answer a question without asking it? But that is a large part of the pressure that you're putting on yourself. And then the second thing, and this is something that you guys can do because you guys are really young, which is to try different things and to see what's making you happy or not, and what makes you feel like you're on the path to success or not. And I think that's what you guys should be doing for the next 5 years to almost sort of punt the burden of figuring this out for another 5 years and be like, for the next 5 years, we're just going to try as many different things as we can and see what we're enjoying and what we're not enjoying. And I think that should be the power that should liberate you, and that should sort of guide you versus the crushing burden of, can I figure this out? And actually, if you ask any successful person, even if you ask sort of the Steve Jobs or anybody else in the world, even they say like the dots connect at the end, not at the beginning. Like you can't engineer your life to success. You can't, the happy accidents, you can't figure out which accident is going to lead to the next. What you can do is do as many different things as possible to see what's exciting you, what's not exciting you. So take that forward and don't put the burden of, what is happiness, what is successful on your shoulders to figure it all out, because nobody's figured it all out.
Great advice. And I think that's all we have time for. So, Omer.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bilal, for coming to our podcast. And to the audience, thank you for making it this far. As always, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, do follow us on Instagram and Twitter at acupofcoffeepod, or email us at acupofcoffeepod@gmail.com. Be sure to email us or send us a DM or tweet if you're interested in being on the podcast or just have some general questions. And cue outro, everyone. Goodbye.